What's something you saw as a kid but didn't realize was messed up until you were older? Growing up, my neighbor Mr. Wilson was our town's hero. Everyone loved him. He ran the local hardware store, coached Little League, and every Christmas he'd dress as Santa and hand out the most amazing toys to all the neighborhood kids. These weren't just regular toys you could buy at the store. Each child got something unique and special. Handmade wooden trains with real working wheels, dollhouses with tiny furniture that looked exactly like the real thing, or intricate model airplanes that actually flew. My favorite was the music box he gave me when I was 8. It was shaped like a carousel with tiny horses that moved up and down while playing the prettiest melody I'd ever heard. It had my name painted in gold letters on the base. I treasured it more than anything. What made Mr. Wilson even more interesting was his workshop. It took up his entire basement, filled with woodworking tools, paint supplies, and shelves of half-finished projects. Sometimes he'd let us kids peek inside, but never touch anything because it was dangerous for little fingers. The strangest thing about Mr. Wilson was his collection trips. 3 or 4 times a year, he'd load up his van and disappear for a week. When he returned, his van would be packed with bags of what he called special materials for his projects. He'd carry them straight to his workshop, always after dark. One time I asked where he got all his supplies. He winked and said, "I have special connections who know I'll put their treasures to good use." Then he'd let us help unpack the safe stuff. Beautiful fabrics, unique buttons, and wood pieces with interesting patterns. When I was 12, Mr. Wilson gave me a beautiful china doll with a porcelain face that looked so lifelike. "This one's special," he whispered. "Made her just for you." The doll wore a dress with delicate lace and had real human hair that felt soft between my fingers. I named her Eliza and kept her on my bookshelf for years. Fast forward 15 years, I was helping my parents clean their attic when I found a box of old newspapers. One headline caught my eye: "Local cemetery vandalized again." The article was from my childhood, describing how someone had been breaking into crypts and graves, stealing personal items buried with the deceased. There was a quote from a grieving mother: "They took my daughter's music box. It played her favorite song and had her name, Emily, painted on it. How could someone be so heartless?" My blood ran cold. I pulled out my phone and searched for more articles. There were dozens spanning 20 years, all describing cemetery thefts in neighboring towns. Items stolen included antique dolls, handcrafted toys, musical instruments, and jewelry. One article included a photo of a grieving family at a funeral. The open casket showed a young girl with a china doll clutched in her hands. A doll identical to my Eliza. That night, I drove to my parents' house and dug through my childhood keepsakes until I found my carousel music box. With shaking hands, I turned it over. There was a small inscription I'd never noticed before, partially scraped away but still readable. "To Emily, with eternal love." I realized with horror that my treasured childhood toys weren't handmade by Mr. Wilson. They were stolen from the dead children they were buried with. And the special materials from his collection trips. They came from freshly dug graves. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I sat there in my childhood bedroom, holding what I now knew was a dead child's music box, and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. Mr. Wilson hadn't been our town's beloved Santa Claus. He'd been desecrating graves and stealing from grieving families for decades. My hands were shaking as I carefully placed the music box back in its box. How many other kids in our neighborhood had received similar gifts? How many families had buried their children with precious keepsakes, only to have them stolen and distributed as Christmas presents? I needed to see the doll again. Eliza had been stored in my parents' garage for years, packed away with other childhood memories I couldn't bear to throw away but didn't really want to keep. I found her in a dusty cardboard box, still wearing that beautiful lace dress, her porcelain face as perfect as ever. But now, looking at her with adult eyes and this new knowledge, everything about her seemed different. The way her glass eyes seemed to stare right through me. The too perfect curl of her real human hair, the slight discoloration around her dress where what? Embalming fluid had seeped through. I turned her over, looking for any markings or inscriptions. On the back of her head, barely visible under her hair, I found what I was looking for: Sarah Beth Morrison, age 7, 1998 to 2005. My stomach lurched. This wasn't just any doll, this was buried with a specific child. A 7-year-old girl named Sarah Beth, who had died when I was 12. Someone's daughter, someone's baby, had been laid to rest with this doll clutched in her arms, and Mr. Wilson had violated that sacred space to steal it for me. I immediately Googled Sarah Beth Morrison's name. The obituary was the first result, complete with a photo that made my heart break. She was beautiful, blonde hair in pigtails, gap-toothed smile, wearing a dress remarkably similar to the one on the doll. The obituary mentioned she died in a car accident and was laid to rest with her beloved doll collection and favorite music box. Music box. Just like Emily's. Just like mine. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was absolutely horrifying. Mr. Wilson had been running a systematic operation, targeting recent child burials and stealing the most precious items buried with them. Then he'd refurbish them and give them away as gifts, probably to cover his tracks and make himself look like a hero in the community. I spent the rest of that night researching, diving deeper into the rabbit hole of cemetery thefts in our area. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Child dies, funeral happens, within a few weeks the grave is vandalized and personal items are stolen. Then, a few months later, those items would mysteriously appear as Mr. Wilson's handmade Christmas gifts. But it was worse than just theft. Reading through the old police reports, I discovered that Mr. Wilson hadn't just been taking random items, he'd been specifically targeting the most meaningful possessions, items that families had chosen to bury with their children because they couldn't bear to part with them. Wedding rings from tiny fingers, stuffed animals that had provided comfort during final illnesses, photo lockets with family pictures inside. Each stolen item represented someone's most profound grief, their final gift to a child they'd never see grow up. Around 3 a.m., I finally worked up the courage to call the police. The desk sergeant listened to my story with growing concern, taking down Mr. Wilson's address and asking me to come in first thing in the morning to file a formal report. "Ma'am," he said before hanging up, "you should know we've been getting similar calls all week. Seems like a lot of people your age are putting together the same pieces you did." I wasn't alone. Other kids from the neighborhood were having the same horrible realization about their childhood gifts. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. How many of us had been unknowingly playing with items stolen from dead children? The next morning, I drove to the police station with both the music box and the doll. Detective Martinez, a kind-looking woman in her 40s, listened to my story while taking detailed notes. "We're opening a full investigation," she told me. "Your neighbor has been on our radar for years, but we never had enough evidence to get a warrant. These items you've brought in, combined with the other reports we've received, should be enough." Other reports. So far we've had 12 people come forward. All of them received gifts from Mr. Wilson as children. All of them now realize those gifts were stolen from graves. We're expecting more. Detective Martinez explained that they'd been tracking the cemetery thefts for decades, but could never connect them to anyone specific. The crimes were always clean, professional even. Whoever was doing it knew exactly what they were looking for, and how to avoid detection. He'd wait until weather was bad, she explained, when security would be minimal. Storm nights, heavy snow, anything that would keep people away from the cemeteries. He had it down to a science. They were planning to execute a search warrant on Mr. Wilson's house that afternoon. Detective Martinez asked if I'd be willing to identify any other items that might have been in his workshop, things I might have seen as a child, but not thought suspicious at the time. I agreed, though the thought of going back to that house, of seeing Mr. Wilson again, made me feel sick. The search warrant was executed at 2 p.m. I watched from across the street as police cars surrounded the house I'd visited countless times as a child. Mr. Wilson, now in his 70s with gray hair and the same kind smile I remembered, was led away in handcuffs. He looked confused, frightened, nothing like the confident, jolly man who'd given me Eliza all those years ago. Detective Martinez called me over to look at what they'd found in the workshop. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The basement that had once seemed magical to my child's eyes was revealed as something far more sinister. Shelves lined the walls, filled with hundreds of items clearly taken from graves. Not just toys, but jewelry, photographs, religious items, even small pieces of clothing. Each item was tagged with information, dates, locations, sometimes even names. Mr. Wilson had been keeping meticulous records of his thefts, like some kind of twisted inventory system. But the most disturbing discovery was a wall covered with photographs. Pictures of children's funerals, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Wilson had been attending these services, photographing them, using them to plan his thefts. In many of the photos, you could see the items buried with the children, items that later appeared on his workshop shelves. He was hunting them. Detective Martinez said quietly, stalking grieving families, planning which graves to rob based on what he saw at the funerals. In a corner of the workshop, we found boxes of newspaper clippings, obituaries of children, dating back 30 years. He'd been doing this much longer than anyone had realized. Each obituary was annotated with notes about burial locations, family details, and items mentioned in the death notices. The scope of it was overwhelming. This wasn't opportunistic grave robbing, this was a calculated long-term operation targeting the most vulnerable people in our community. Detective Martinez showed me a ledger they'd found, filled with Mr. Wilson's handwriting. In it, he documented every theft, every item stolen, and what he'd done with each piece. Many items had been given away as gifts, but others had been sold to antique dealers or collectors who didn't ask questions about provenance. "Look at this entry," she said, pointing to a page dated December 1998. Sarah Beth Morrison, St. Mary's Cemetery china doll and jewelry box. Doll given to neighbor child, jewelry box sold to antique barn on Route 9. My doll. My Eliza. Listed like inventory in a criminal ledger. But the most chilling discovery came when they opened a locked filing cabinet. Inside were hundreds of photographs, not just of funerals, but of the children who'd received his gifts. Pictures of me playing with the music box. Photos of other neighborhood kids with their stolen toys. He'd been documenting his crimes, watching us enjoy items taken from dead children. Some of the photos were taken through windows, showing children in their bedrooms playing with the stolen items. Others were taken at Christmas parties or birthday celebrations. Mr. Wilson had been surveilling the entire neighborhood, using his position as the friendly local businessman to get close to families and photograph their children. The investigation revealed that Mr. Wilson's operation had been far more extensive than anyone imagined. Police found evidence of thefts in over 40 cemeteries across 3 states. Hundreds of graves had been violated, thousands of items stolen over the course of 3 decades. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how he'd used the gifts to integrate himself deeper into the community. By giving stolen items to local children, he'd created a network of unwitting accomplices. We'd all vouched for his character, defended him if anyone had suspicions, because how could someone who gave such beautiful gifts to children be anything but wonderful? The community response was swift and devastating. The hardware store was boycotted immediately. The Little League removed all references to his coaching from their records. Parents who trusted him with their children were horrified to learn what he'd really been doing during those late-night workshop sessions. But the real victims were the families of the deceased children. Detective Martinez arranged meetings between the police and the affected families, returning stolen items where possible. I attended one of these meetings, hoping to return Eliza to Sarah Beth Morrison's family. Sarah's mother, Mrs. Morrison, was a thin woman with graying hair and eyes that held a deep, permanent sadness. When I handed her the doll, she broke down completely. "I chose this dress," she whispered, running her fingers over the lace. "I wanted her to look pretty. I wanted her to have something beautiful to hold forever." She didn't blame me. I was just a child when I received the doll. But the guilt was overwhelming. I'd played with this doll for months, never knowing it had been stolen from a little girl's grave, from parents who were trying to give their daughter some comfort in death. Mrs. Morrison told me about the night someone had broken into Sarah's grave. "I visited every day," she said. "One morning, I found the ground disturbed, the headstone moved. I knew someone had been there, but the police said nothing was missing. I guess they just couldn't see inside the casket." The thought of Mr. Wilson opening a child's casket, reaching inside to steal a doll from a 7-year-old's arms, was almost too horrible to contemplate. But that's exactly what he'd done, dozens of times, to hundreds of children. The legal proceedings moved quickly. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Mr. Wilson pled guilty to multiple counts of grave desecration, theft and abuse of a corpse. The sentence was 25 years to life, ensuring he'd die in prison. But the investigation revealed even more disturbing details during the trial. Mr. Wilson had kept detailed journals describing his crimes, written in a matter-of-fact tone that showed no remorse or recognition of the pain he'd caused. One entry, read aloud in court, described breaking into Sarah Beth Morrison's grave, subject buried with extensive doll collection. Casket easily accessed, selected highest quality items for redistribution. Subjects at this age typically buried with sentimental rather than valuable items. Perfect for gift giving. He'd referred to dead children as subjects. He described violating their graves as redistribution. There was no humanity in his writing, no acknowledgement that these were someone's babies he was stealing from. The psychological evaluation revealed that Mr. Wilson had developed an elaborate justification system for his crimes. He genuinely believed he was doing something good by rescuing items from graves and giving them to living children who could appreciate them. In his twisted logic, leaving toys buried with dead children was wasteful. Dr. Patricia Henning, the forensic psychologist who evaluated him, testified that Mr. Wilson showed classic signs of antisocial personality disorder combined with what she termed acquisitive behavior disorder. An obsessive need to collect and redistribute items regardless of their source or the pain caused by obtaining them. He saw the dead children as a resource to be exploited, she explained to the court. In his mind, They no longer needed their possessions, so taking them wasn't theft. It was recycling. The community impact was profound and long-lasting. Trust had been shattered, not just in Mr. Wilson, but in the basic assumption that respected community members were what they appeared to be. Parents became suspicious of anyone who showed too much interest in their children. The Little League struggled to find coaches, as volunteers were subjected to extensive background checks and scrutiny. But perhaps most significantly, the case changed how we handled child burials in our area. New security measures were implemented at cemeteries. Surveillance cameras were installed. Policies were changed to better protect recently buried remains. Sarah Beth Morrison's grave, and dozens of others, were restored and properly secured. The ripple effects extended beyond our small town. News of the case spread nationally, leading to similar investigations in other communities. Police departments began looking at unsolved cemetery thefts with new eyes, wondering if they too had their own Mr. Wilson operating in plain sight. I attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery with other victims' families and former neighborhood children who'd received stolen gifts. It was important to me to see justice served, but also to try to understand how someone could commit such horrible crimes while maintaining the facade of a beloved community member. Mr. Wilson never looked at us during the proceedings. He sat quietly at the defense table, occasionally whispering to his lawyer, but showing no emotion as the details of his crimes were laid out in excruciating detail. Even when photographs of violated graves were shown, even when family members gave tearful victim impact statements, he remained impassive. On the day of sentencing, the judge allowed several people to speak before passing judgment. Mrs. Morrison spoke about the ongoing pain of knowing her daughter's grave had been violated. Other parents described the secondary trauma of learning that items meant to comfort their children in death had been stolen and given away. I also chose to speak. Standing at the podium, looking at Mr. Wilson for the first time since his arrest, I tried to articulate the complex emotions I'd been struggling with for months. Your Honor, I began, my voice shaking. Mr. Wilson stole more than just objects from graves. He stole our innocence, our trust, our ability to grieve in peace. Every child who received one of his gifts now has to live with the knowledge that we were unknowing participants in his crimes. I told the court about the nightmares I'd been having, dreams where I was playing with Eliza while Sarah Beth Morrison watched from the shadows, reaching out for her doll. I described the guilt of having treasured something that had been meant to bring comfort to a dead child. The worst part, I concluded, is that he made us all complicit. He used our childhood joy, our excitement about receiving beautiful gifts, to hide his crimes. He turned our happiness into evidence of his success. When I finished speaking, I looked directly at Mr. Wilson for the first time. For just a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw something that might have been shame or regret cross his face. But it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure. The judge sentenced him to the maximum penalty, 25 years to life, with no possibility of parole for the first 25 years. Given his age, it was effectively a death sentence. Mr. Wilson would die in prison, never again able to hurt grieving families or steal from dead children. As the bailiff led him away, Mr. Wilson turned and looked back at the gallery filled with his victims. For the first time during the entire proceedings, I saw real emotion on his face. Not remorse, but something closer to confusion. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the pain he'd caused, unable to understand why people were so upset about what he considered his generous gift-giving. That look haunted me for months afterward. The complete disconnect between his actions and his understanding of their impact was perhaps more disturbing than outright malice would have been. The aftermath of the trial brought some closure, but also new challenges. A support group was formed for people who'd received stolen items as children. We met monthly in the basement of the community center, sharing our experiences and trying to process the complex emotions surrounding our unwitting participation in Mr. Wilson's crimes. Some members of the group struggled with intense guilt, feeling responsible for the joy they'd experienced playing with stolen items. Others dealt with trust issues, becoming suspicious of gifts and generosity from others. A few developed anxiety around cemeteries and funerals, unable to shake the knowledge of what Mr. Wilson had done in those sacred spaces. For me, the most difficult aspect was reconciling my childhood memories with the reality of Mr. Wilson's crimes. I genuinely loved that music box, had spent countless hours listening to its melody and watching the tiny horses dance. Those moments of pure childhood joy were now tainted by the knowledge of where the music box had really come from. Sarah Chen, the therapist who facilitated our support group, helped us understand that our feelings were normal and valid. You were children, she reminded us repeatedly. You cannot be held responsible for crimes committed by an adult who deliberately deceived you and your families. but understanding that intellectually was different from feeling it emotionally. The guilt persisted, especially when I thought about Emily, the original owner of my music box. What would she think if she knew a stranger had played with her most precious possession while she lay in the ground without it? Through the support group, I connected with other victims' families. Emily's mother, Mrs. Patricia Henderson, reached out to me after learning that I'd been given her daughter's music box. We met for coffee on a gray Saturday morning, both nervous about the encounter. Mrs. Henderson was an elegant woman in her 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded me painfully of Emily in her obituary photo. She brought a photo album filled with pictures of Emily playing with the music box, unwrapping it on her 6th birthday, dancing to its melody in their living room, carefully winding it up each night before bed. She called it her princess box. Mrs. Henderson told me, tears streaming down her face. She said the horses were dancing for a royal ball. Every night she'd wind it up and dance along until the music stopped. I broke down completely, sobbing as I realized how much that music box had meant to Emily, how it had been her constant companion during her short life. Mrs. Henderson reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm not angry with you, dear," she said softly. "You loved it too. In a way, that's what Emily would have wanted for her music box to bring joy to another little girl." Her forgiveness was both healing and devastating. I didn't deserve such grace, but Mrs. Henderson gave it freely, understanding that I was as much a victim of Mr. Wilson's crimes as her family was. We began meeting regularly, and she shared stories about Emily, her love of horses, her dream of becoming a veterinarian, her habit of leaving notes for the tooth fairy. Through these conversations, Emily became more than just a name on a stolen music box. She became real to me, a little girl whose life had been cut short but whose memory deserved to be honored. Mrs. Henderson and I decided to establish a memorial fund in Emily's name, dedicated to providing comfort items for children in hospital pediatric wards. It seemed fitting that Emily's legacy should involve bringing joy to other children, just as her music box had brought joy to me, albeit through tragic circumstances. The fund grew beyond our expectations. Other families affected by Mr. Wilson's crimes contributed, as did members of our support group and the broader community. We were able to provide thousands of stuffed animals, blankets, and comfort items to children facing serious illnesses. But the investigation into Mr. Wilson's crimes continued even after his sentencing. Police discovered that his network had been more extensive than initially realized. He'd had contacts at funeral homes who provided him with information about upcoming burials. He'd cultivated relationships with cemetery workers who looked the other way during his nocturnal visits. Some of these accomplices were prosecuted, while others cooperated with authorities in exchange for lighter sentences. The scope of corruption was shocking. What had appeared to be isolated grave robberies were actually part of a sophisticated criminal network that had operated for decades. Funeral directors had accepted payments to provide burial information. Security guards had been bribed to disable surveillance systems. Even some clergy had been complicit, providing details about funeral services and burial plans. Detective Martinez, who had become something of a friend through the long investigation, explained that Mr. Wilson had been remarkably strategic in building his network. He identified people in the funeral industry who were struggling financially and offered them easy money for information. Once they accepted payment, he had leverage over them. It became a self-perpetuating system. The investigation revealed that over 2,000 graves had been violated across 7 states. Hundreds of families had been victimized, their grief compounded by the violation of their children's resting places. The financial impact was also significant. Many families had spent thousands of dollars on burial items that were subsequently stolen. But beyond the numbers was the human cost. Families who had carefully chosen special items to bury with their children, a favorite teddy bear, a handmade blanket, a locket with family photos, had to live with the knowledge that these precious objects had been stolen and distributed as gifts to strangers. Some families chose to exhume and rebury their children with new items, wanting to ensure their babies had something precious to hold in death. Others found comfort in knowing that the stolen items had brought joy to other children, even under such horrible circumstances. The case also prompted changes in law enforcement approaches to cemetery crimes. A national database was created to track similar thefts, helping investigators identify patterns and potential suspects. Training programs were developed to help police recognize signs of organized grave robbery operations. For me personally, the most profound change was in how I viewed memory and trauma. The support group had taught me that traumatic experiences could be processed and integrated, that healing was possible even from the most disturbing revelations. Dr. Chen helped me understand that my childhood joy in receiving the music box wasn't invalidated by learning its true origin. "You experienced genuine happiness," she explained. That happiness was real, even though it was based on incomplete information. You can honor both your childhood joy and Emily's memory. This perspective was liberating. I could acknowledge the horror of Mr. Wilson's crimes while still valuing the positive memories associated with the gifts he'd given me. The music box had brought me genuine joy as a child, and that joy didn't disappear because of what I learned about its origin. 2 years after Mr. Wilson's conviction, our support group organized a memorial service for all the children whose graves had been violated. We held it in the community center, with representatives from every affected family in attendance. The service was both heartbreaking and healing. We read the names of every child whose grave had been disturbed, sharing memories and honoring their lives. Many families brought photos and told stories about their children, helping us remember them as real people, rather than just victims of crime. Mrs. Henderson spoke about Emily, describing her daughter's love of music and dancing. As she talked, I could picture Emily winding up her music box, dancing to its melody in her bedroom, treasuring it as her most precious possession. At the end of the service, we released balloons, one for each child whose grave had been violated. As they floated up into the sky, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since discovering the truth about Mr. Wilson. It felt like we were giving these children something back, honoring their memories in a way that celebrated their lives rather than focusing on how they'd been victimized after death. The investigation officially concluded 3 years after Mr. Wilson's arrest, but its impact continues to reverberate through our community. Trust has been slowly rebuilt, but the scars remain. Parents are more cautious about who they allow into their children's lives. Cemetery security has been permanently enhanced. The funeral industry has implemented new protocols to prevent similar crimes. For those of us who receive stolen items as children, the journey toward healing has been long and ongoing. Some members of our support group still struggle with trust issues. Others have found ways to honor the memory of the children whose possessions they received. I've kept Emily's music box, but it now sits in a place of honor in my home, next to a framed photo of Emily that Mrs. Henderson gave me. Rather than playing with it, I treat it as a memorial to a little girl who died too young. Sometimes I wind it up and listen to its melody, thinking about Emily dancing in her room, and I feel connected to her memory in a way that brings me peace rather than guilt. The experience has also shaped my career path. I now work as a victim's advocate, helping families navigate the criminal justice system when their loved ones have been victimized. My experience with Mr. Wilson's crimes gave me insight into the complex emotions that victims face, the way trauma can compound and evolve over time. Every few months I receive letters from people across the country who have discovered similar situations in their own communities. The Mr. Wilson case has become a touchstone for understanding how predators can hide in plain sight, using community trust and charitable behavior to mask horrific crimes. These letters remind me that evil often wears a friendly face, that the people we trust most may be the ones capable of causing the greatest harm. But they also remind me of the resilience of communities, the way people can come together to support each other through even the most unthinkable circumstances. Wilson died in prison 2 years into his sentence, taking with him any possibility of understanding why he committed such horrible crimes. His death brought a sense of closure to some victims' families, while others felt cheated of the opportunity to confront him or hear him accept responsibility for his actions. I felt conflicted about his death. Part of me was relieved that he could never hurt anyone again, but part of me regretted that he died without ever expressing genuine remorse or helping us understand his motivations. His house was eventually demolished, the lot remaining empty for years before finally being converted into a small memorial garden. A plaque lists the names of all the children whose graves were violated, ensuring that their memory lives on in the place where their possessions were once stored like trophies. Looking back now, 5 years after the truth came to light, I'm struck by how much I've learned about the nature of trust, memory, and healing. The revelation about Mr. Wilson shattered my childhood understanding of the world, but it also taught me valuable lessons about resilience and the importance of community support. The children in our neighborhood who received stolen gifts have all processed the experience differently. Some moved away, unable to bear living in a place associated with such trauma. Others, like me, chose to stay and work toward healing within the community where the crimes occurred. We've all learned to live with the knowledge that our childhoods were touched by evil, that someone we trusted was capable of unthinkable cruelty. But we've also learned that healing is possible, that trauma can be integrated and transformed into something meaningful. The memorial fund established in Emily's name has grown into a significant charitable organization, providing comfort items and support to thousands of children and families. Her mother and I continue to work together on the fund, finding purpose and healing in honoring Emily's memory through service to others. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never found those old newspapers in my parents' attic, if I'd lived my entire life without knowing the truth about my childhood gifts. Would ignorance have been better than the painful knowledge of where they really came from? But I've come to believe that truth, however painful, is preferable to ignorance. The revelation about Mr. Wilson was devastating, but it also led to justice for his victims and healing for our community. It taught me about the complexity of human nature, the way good and evil can coexist in the same person, the same situation. Most importantly, it taught me about the power of community to heal from trauma. Our support group became a family of sorts, bound together by shared experience and mutual understanding. We helped each other process emotions that no one else could truly comprehend. Today, when I look at Emily's music box sitting on my mantle, I no longer feel the crushing guilt that once overwhelmed me. Instead, I feel a connection to a little girl I never met but whose memory I carry with me. Her music box brought me joy as a child, and now it serves as a reminder of her life and the importance of honoring those we've lost. The case of Mr. Wilson continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blindly trusting people in positions of respect and authority. But it's also a story of resilience, of communities coming together to support each other through unimaginable circumstances. As I write this, sitting in my home office next to Emily's memorial music box, I'm reminded that even the darkest chapters of our lives can be transformed into something meaningful. The horror of Mr. Wilson's crimes will never be erased, but the healing that followed, the connections that were forged, the positive changes that were implemented, these things matter too. We cannot undo the past, but we can choose how we respond to it. We can let trauma define us, or we can find ways to transform it into something that honors the memory of those we've lost and protects others from similar harm. The music box plays its melody as I write, the tiny horses dancing their eternal dance, and I think about Emily, who would be 25 now if she had lived. I wonder what she would have become, what dreams she would have pursued, what joy she would have brought to the world. I can't give her back her life, but I can ensure that her memory lives on through the work we do in her name, through the comfort items provided to sick children, through the story of how a community came together to heal from an unthinkable betrayal of trust. That's something at least. That's a way to transform evil into good, pain into purpose, trauma into healing. And sometimes that's enough.